Stop me if you've heard this one. Or, actually, don't. Even if you've heard it, it's important to the story I'm going to tell. There's an urban legend that I first heard way back in the late 90s when I was in college. It was a popular one on my campus, but I don't know how much further than that it spread. The basic premise was, some engineers got together and developed a prototype VR headset. This was, of course, before the current glut of the things, and so they were understandably excited and couldn't wait to test it out. Sure, they didn't have the technology to make it full color, but that didn't matter. Shades of black and white and gray could still be immersive, after all. And the rest of the graphics were frankly ahead of their time. The first program they loaded up was a sort of virtual reality maze. Do you remember those screensavers from the 90s? The ones where you were in a weird multicolored brick maze? It was the same sort of thing, just without the color. So these guys were just chomping at the bit to try their new technology out, and they'd had some success in short, limited engagement with both the hardware and the maze program. They randomly chose one of the engineers. They all expect that he'll be walking through the virtual maze for 10 minutes, maybe 30 tops. Because how long can you really be engaged in a black and white maze? Well, it turned out that the guy in the headset just keeps it on and keeps it on. Hours start to go by, and he's still wearing the thing and walking around in that virtual maze. His colleagues start to get worried, and they try to talk him into taking it off, but he refuses, saying that he's going to stay inside the maze until he figures it out. So they leave him be. 8 hours he's wearing that headset, then 12, then 24. The other engineers are starting to panic now since he hasn't slept or eaten in a full day. They try to force the headset off of him, but he fights back, snarling and clawing at them. They all try to hold his arms down, but he doesn't let that happen either. And it's starting to look like he'll hurt himself or them before he lets them take it off. So they give him another day, and when he still hasn't taken it off, they call 911. 3 cops have to hold him down, and he has to be sedated entirely. They pull the headset off of him, and when he comes to, he just starts screaming and screaming. He's flailing around wildly and ends up gouging both his eyes out with the metal prongs at the end of the headset strap. Though in some retellings, he claws them out with his fingernails. Turns out, he was so immersed in that black and white world that the colors of real life overwhelmed him, and he had to shut them off by any means necessary. They locked him away in a nut house, because of the eye thing, sure, but also because he was certain, up to the day he died, that he was still trapped in that maze. Now, that urban legend always stuck with me. It's such a perfect combination of the things I liked back then. There was a little cyberpunk, a little Lovecraftian madness, and of course, the completely human aspect of a simple mistake causing dire consequences. So, why am I telling you this particular urban legend? Because it's not an urban legend at all. It's real. I know because I found the VR headset, and I put it on. I never left that college town where I first heard the story of the VR prototype. I got married, had kids, and became the kind of incredibly boring person who hits up garage sales and estate sales for fun on the weekends. I became the kind of person who says things like, "We've got to get there right at 7 a.m. before the good stuff is all gone." And actually, as I think about it now, that's the mentality that screwed me over. Because it was just such a morning, and at just such an ungodly hour, that I came across an estate sale on the south side of town. I was among the first people there, just me and a couple of very old women. I was sifting through the weird mix of items in the sale, passing over old 8-track players and Apple computers from the early 90s. It became clear pretty quickly that whoever had passed away and left this stuff was a techie from way back, an early adopter from the time when that meant you were a weirdo who built computers in the basement. Though all that stuff appealed to me, what really caught my eye was a headset buried in a box under a bunch of old floppy disks and hard drives. It was made of metal and beginning to rust, but I could tell instantly what it was supposed to be. There were goggles that stuck out like a pair of binoculars, and some black fabric that clearly was meant to block out light from the sides. A couple of wires ran down to a pair of gloves with copper-tipped fingers. From the back, a couple of wires led down to a battery pack that looked like it was supposed to hook onto a belt. It was cool as hell, and I figured even if it didn't work, which it couldn't possibly, it would make for a sweet addition to a Halloween costume at the very least. "Do you know what this is, or if it works?" I asked the bored teenage girl behind the card table that served as the checkout counter. She only shrugged. "All items sold as is." I didn't care. I slapped $20 on the table and left happy, regardless of whether it worked. It looked cool as hell. The batteries were badly corroded, I discovered when I got home. But with a little work, I was able to get the pack cleaned up and the battery replaced by something that seemed more or less to fit. It was something of a revelation when I flipped the power toggle and saw the old headset hum to life. Lights pulsed in the goggles, and it was all I could do to stop myself from putting it on right then and there. But I wanted to make sure it wasn't going to burn my retinas up, so I let it run for a bit, testing out the goggles from afar without putting the thing fully on my head. When I was satisfied that it seemed to work properly and no bolts of electricity spewed forth from it, I carefully placed the contraption on my hands and head. I immediately felt a tingle of electric current in my fingertips, but it wasn't unpleasant in the slightest. It was like I was suddenly making full use of my sense of touch. I spread my fingers apart, and as I did so, the screen in front of my eyes came to life. I was standing in what could be nothing else but a supermarket. On my left was an aisle filled with cereal boxes, and on my right was a produce display piled high with apples and oranges. At least, that's what I thought they were. As I approached, I saw that I could only recognize them by their shape. I picked up an orange and stared at it, wondering why it looked so unfamiliar. I could feel the cool roughness of its rind and the gentle weight of it in my hand. It was unmistakably an orange. I lifted it curiously to my nose, and to my immense shock, it smelled strongly of citrus. I dropped the orange and watched as it rolled underneath the display. Why could I smell it? There certainly wasn't anything in the VR set that could create a smell, but it was there. I held my fingers to my face, and the same scent was there, muted slightly, but certainly present. I sat down on the cool grocery store floor and stared around in bewilderment. Then I understood why everything looked so off. The store I was in, and everything in it, was in grayscale. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it, and I realized with a jolt why it had taken me so long to notice. I leapt to my feet and spun around. Everything in the store was rendered in an absolutely realistic fashion. There were no discernible pixels, no rough edges, no delay in movement. More than that, I could see details on surfaces that I'd never even noticed before. This was not something that could have been accomplished by a program made at the same time as this antique headset. It wasn't even something that could be made now. I was standing in a real supermarket. I was sure of it. I stepped back and stumbled as my foot landed on the orange I had dropped earlier. The fruit split open, and waves of its citrus scent washed over me. The sticky juices clung to my shoe, causing a definite squelching sound as I walked along the stacks of fruits and vegetables, piled up to the ceiling. What a remarkable detail, I thought. It was as if the developers had considered every possible outcome when making this program. Would the same sort of thing happen if I smashed a banana? Would I smell the familiar scent of sugary cereal if I opened one of the boxes that lined the aisles? I walked cautiously toward the cereal aisle, staring at the black and white cartoon faces looking back at me. Their eyes were bright and shining, their smiles twisted and mocking. The cartoon walrus holding a spoon piled with samurai stars furrowed its brow as I walked closer, its whiskers swaying softly each time it exhaled. "What the hell?" I whispered to myself. At least, I thought it was to myself. In response, the cartoons on the cereal boxes began to laugh, softly at first, like they were trying to suppress their giggles, then louder and louder until their shrill braying thundered in my ears. Was there a speaker on the headset? A microphone? The thought passed briefly through my mind as I retreated from the cereal aisle, all thoughts of opening the boxes abandoned. Suddenly, I didn't want to explore this virtual grocery store. I didn't want to experience all that this technology could offer. It was realistic, sure, more than realistic even, but I needed to get out. I fumbled at my head, trying to remove the headset that perched up there. But my hands passed through air and I found myself grabbing onto nothing but my own hair. I swallowed hard and slowed my breathing. There was no use in panicking. None of this was real. I walked back down the produce aisle, looking for an exit. It seemed like I walked forever, the produce repeating every so often, like a film reel behind me. I changed my direction, veering left until I hit a wall and followed it for what felt like miles. Finally, I came to a closed door labeled, "Employees Only." I pushed it open. There were 5 of them there, all teenagers by the looks of them, and they were huddled in folding chairs in a semicircle around an old television set. "Hey, could one of you help me?" The lanky teenager closest to me turned around and shot me a dirty look. "Sorry, I'm just trying to—" "Shh!" He hissed at me and turned back to the television. I walked up behind them and focused on what they were watching. The on-screen was my living room, with me standing in the middle of it. I bent forward to get a better look, and the me on the television did the same thing. The teenagers giggled and elbowed one another. On the television, my wife was standing next to me, her head in her hands. She looked like she was pleading with me. Her face was puffy from crying, and she had a wild look in her eyes that I'd never seen before. I reached out toward the television, and the other me did the same, reaching forward toward nothing. On screen, my wife came towards me, hands outstretched. To do what? She grasped at my headset, but the me on the television roared at her and hit wildly, making contact with her face and knocking her to the ground. "No! No! I'm not doing that! I'm just standing here. I'm not doing that! I wouldn't!" On the screen, my own words echoed back at me. The teenagers were doubled over, howling with laughter. I looked down at my hands. The knuckles were scraped and swollen like I'd been in a fist fight. They hurt. My head hurt too. It throbbed where the headset touched my skin. I burst back out of the door and into the grocery store. I ran wildly around the perimeter from one corner to the next, but there were no other doors. There wasn't anything but the same stretch of polished tile floors and columns of food that I'd passed by over and over again. It was about the 5th time that I passed the refrigerated meat display case when I saw the man. He was dressed in a long coat and facing the ground beef. I approached him slowly, unsure if I wanted to speak to him or not. He spoke before I could make that decision.
"Hey, buddy,"
he said, looking at the case of gray meat instead of me. "Yeah," I said, voice shaking.
"They're about to take you out there. They're planning on giving you a sedative or
he said, motioning to his head. He still faced away from me. "Good. I want to get out of here. I want this thing off of me. I want to go home." A dry laugh barked out from the man.
"No, you don't."
"Yeah, I do. My life is back there, not in some sort of supermarket. Why the hell did they program a grocery store into this thing anyway? Who wants that?"
"You'll want it, trust me."
Shadows covered the man's features as he began to turn my way. I recoiled instinctively, even though I couldn't make him out. The fluorescent lights above us flickered and hummed as the man's face came into view. I squinted. His face was just beyond my sight and my understanding. His mouth opened and the words came out as if they were falling.
It's too late.
Then all there was blackness. I woke up in a hospital bed, restraints around my wrists and ankles. The room was bathed in lurid colors, whites and eggshells and beiges and pinks so repulsive I could have vomited. My wife sat asleep in the chair next to me. At least I thought it must have been her. Her face disappeared into the purple of her bruises and the rough rendering of her features. When she opened her eyes and looked at me, all I could see were the bright blue pixelated squares where her irises used to be. I screamed until they sedated me. Then I woke up and repeated the same process. If I was awake, I was screaming. Until one day, I wasn't. I think I must have finally gotten the right mix of medications because I can't scream anymore. But that doesn't mean that I don't want to. Everything about this world is wrong and crude, as if drawn by a child. The colors are too bright. That much in the original urban legend was true. But that's not the problem. The problem is that this feels like such a poor facsimile of life that I don't know how anyone could think it was real. How can you think this is real? How can you think this is real? How can you think this is real?